Test, test, test.
Testing.
Welcome to AT&T's teleconference service. Please enter your access code, followed by the pound sign. There are 1 participants on the call, including you. You are joining your conference as the host. For a menu of available commands, press star pound.
Hello.
Hi, we're just waiting for the members of the task force to show up.
Oh, no problem, Danielle.
All right, thank you.
Is this Danielle?
Yes, it is.
All right, thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, the clock says it's 10:05, so we want to get started and not keep you any longer, and we'll work as a committee of the whole until such time as my colleague joins us. He is expected shortly. So we will call the meeting to order. We will come back to establish the presence of a quorum, looking to the clerk. That takes us to public comment. And Mr. Largent, I see we have a card from you. Would you like to come up and speak under public comment? Thank you.
Okay, ready when you are, David. Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Scott Largent. A year ago today, I was arrested out in front of the Family Justice Center in Santa Clara County. I was utilizing one of these. Okay? This is a kid's toy megaphone. 10 for $1 at the dollar store. Okay? And I was arrested, put into the snake chambers below the Family Justice Center. It was quite an interesting experience. And then I was transferred over to the Santa Clara County Jail. I was arrested over this order right here. And Joe, you're very familiar with this order because I've talked about it a lot in here. I've also called you out on getting a hold of me or responding to me about this order because, Joe, you went silent. So after that meeting, when you chimed in with James Williams, told him to replicate the document, meet with you after the meeting, figure some things out about this unconstitutional order, I never heard back from you or you, James Williams, okay? So what I did is I kept fighting out there in front of family court, okay? I wanted my visitation enforced to see this little girl right here, Joe, okay? I wanted my visitation enforced twice a week for 4 hours, okay? Valid court orders. Nothing wrong with what I was doing out in front of there. Could you imagine the cost that the county is going to incur right now, Joe, with the fact that you guys left me high and dry? I mean, just think about it for a little bit right here. They have bounced me between so many different attorneys right now, okay, that right now, it's just a circus over there. Now, I come to the Federal Affairs Task Force meeting because I really wonder when people higher up the ladder are going to start to realize how badly our civil rights are being violated here in Santa Clara County. I'm very frustrated. I thought I came to the right spot. Now, these things can happen out in front of your district too, Joe. Your courthouse out there maybe needs somebody like myself out there with a megaphone. Maybe I need to let your constituents know that this crap right here is going to prevent them from protesting. And when a woman out in Palo Alto has to go through a high-end divorce and just get destroyed in our family courts, wouldn't we want her to be able to speak up, exercise her democratic values, stand out in front of that courthouse and let people know what's going on in our judicial system? Well, Joe, they're not going to be able to do it. And this junk is still being spewed out in front of our courthouses, and I'm going to a jury trial in 2 weeks on this stuff. Are you guys just going to still keep me in the dark? Am I ever going to hear back from you, Joe? James, maybe a return phone call? Maybe, hey, Scott, we looked into it. You can get out there and exercise your First Amendment rights.
And thank you for your comments. I'm going to check with the clerk to make sure we have no other cards under public comment. We do not. So that will take us to item number 3, which is to approve the consent calendar, which is simply the approval of the minutes, and we will wait until we're joined by Supervisor Cortese for that. And that would mean we would go to item number 4, which is to receive verbal reports from the chairperson and the vice chair relating to items of interest to the task force. And the only thing I would share at this time, just for the record, and with staff in particular and with our consultants and our team here from the County Executive's Office, is that a few weeks ago, I did have the opportunity to visit Washington with the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. I was on my way there probably maybe a month ago now that I think about it. While there, I had the opportunity to not only participate in the leadership group's series of meetings with folks on Capitol Hill, including Senator Feinstein and both Democrats and Republicans from around the country, but also to meet with our team from Prime Policy, spend some time with them, which I appreciated. both to get updated and to delve into some particular issues, and then to meet with members of our Silicon Valley delegation, including Congresswoman Lofgren and Eshu and Panetta and Khanna, and then Congressman Lowenthal and Desaulnier as well. So an opportunity to raise some of these issues. I will say, and I've shared this with our team, on one of the issues that we're going to get to later today on the issue of immigration, I was struck by the sort of recurring twin themes, which is, this really needs to get resolved, and no, we don't have much hope that it's going to get resolved anytime soon. And occasionally somebody could muster a somewhat more hopeful note on that subject, but in general, I did not come away optimistic. There were a lot of, we could do this, we could try that, we could go down this path, we could go down, but it was hard to think that there was going to be significant progress, let alone a comprehensive response to these issues anytime before the end of this year. And then, of course, that plunges us into a presidential election year where progress seems even less likely in some respects. So I wish I brought back a more hopeful report, but that was the experience there. Why don't we go to item number 5 to receive the verbal report from the Office of County Executive. Mr. Marquez, I know you're sitting in for the county exec today. Anything you would like to share on these federal issues?
No, simply to say we are tracking any number of issues, but we do have Prime Policy Group here to present today. And Burt Margolin's report will also include an update on the prescription drug pricing legislation. So with that, we'll defer to those two presenters on the issues.
All right, thank you. And County Council, you want to walk us through the never-ending series of efforts that our county is engaged in to try to make things right?
Good morning. We've attached our updated grid that we prepare for each of these meetings. It's now up to 48 pages, which I think speaks for itself in terms of the volume of cases that we are either closely tracking or participating as amicus or are ourselves engaged as a party. There are not a lot of significant updates in the cases where we are a party. Mostly we're waiting for decisions. For example, the net neutrality case, we're still waiting for a decision from the D.C. Circuit. We have jumped in to provide amicus support in some other cases of note, including the census citizenship question case that's before the U.S. Supreme Court. We authored an amicus brief on behalf of a coalition of local governments. It's a significant case. Oral argument was recently heard. We expect a decision probably at the end of the Supreme Court's term in June. The other significant one I just wanted to point out is that we also led a coalition in drafting. We drafted the amicus brief in the appeal of the injunction against the Affordable Care Act coming out of the case that Texas filed. That case is now pending before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. All of our other activities kind of noted here. The updates are in red. With that, we're happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much. I do want to come back to the census issue later in the agenda because I'd like to hear from Congressman Khanna's office as well, but rather than take it up under the legal topic or legal heading, we'll take it up as an item when we get to it with the rest of the presentation. All right, that gets us to the main event, and we will ask Mr. Marquez to introduce staff and have them introduce our consultants who are here today. And is Mr. Margolin on the phone line with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Great. Thank you so much for being with us again today. Mr. Marquez?
Thank you, and I will ask Danielle Christian from our office to please introduce both herself and the rest of the team, please.
Thank you. Danielle Christian, Legislative Manager. We have our team from Prime Policy Group here. We also have 2 members of our team that are on the conference line. I'll mention the names of the people on the conference line and then ask the people here to introduce themselves. We have Liz Thompson on the phone, as well as Marty Payoni.
Thank you very much. And with us today are?
And I'm Rich Mead. I'm the Vice Chairman of Prime and part of the team that represents Santa Clara County.
And I'm Erin Dorton, also from the Prime Policy Group, and we work closely with Santa Clara County.
Thank you both very much, and thank you to those of you who are on the line. Why don't we just, I understand we've got a presentation. Why don't we go ahead and march through it? And then I think what I'll do is I'll try and hold off on questions until you make your way through the whole thing, and then go back and ask questions. And if my colleague has been able to join us by then, we'll give him the opportunity as well for questions and comments. Okay? March us through it. Thank you.
Great. So I will go ahead and start, and I'll do the first few slides.
Thank you.
With the polarizing political climate coming out of the White House, an ever-increasing list of candidates for the Democratic nomination, 22 Senate Republicans up for re-election, a new progressive voice for Democrats in the House of Representatives, and the Mueller report and talk of impeachment overshadowing everything, 2020 is shaping up to be a year to watch, and it's anyone's guess how it plays out. Here's a look at just a few of the factors at play. With respect to the Mueller report, generally speaking, the report has indicated that there's insufficient evidence to conclude that the Trump campaign actively collaborated with the Russian government. Additionally, there's no specific determination about whether the evidence amounts to obstruction of justice. However, what is unwritten is a pathway that has been laid out for the Congress to pursue, should they so choose. I should note that developments of yesterday have raised more red flags for which Attorney General Barr will have to answer in further congressional testimony. One instance of that is taking place as we speak in front of Senate Judiciary. So will Congress move toward impeachment? The reality is that without a smoking gun, the outlook for such a route is very bleak in the Senate. Additionally, Speaker Pelosi is adamantly against pursuing impeachment as of this moment. She lived through the tumultuous portion of the 90s when President Clinton was impeached by the House, and she knows that it is divisive and painful for the country. She will, however, work in conjunction with the appropriate committees in the House to allow them to do their due diligence via their congressional authority. With respect to the Senate, next slide, please. With respect to the Senate, the Republicans currently control 22 out of 34 Senate seats that are up for re-election in 2020. This would seem like it would be easy for Democrats to take control of the Senate. If the Democrats win the White House, they would need only to hold the seats that they have and pick up 3 more, as the incoming vice president would be a tiebreaker. The problem for Democrats is that the majority of those 22 Republican seats are safely in red states. However, in Colorado, Maine, Iowa, Arizona, and North Carolina, seats could easily flip depending on the candidates that are fielded and the political challenges facing Republicans over the next year. In Georgia and Texas, that flip is much less likely, but based on the performance in the last election, they are worth watching. On the Democratic side, the currently democratically controlled Alabama Senate seat will most likely be up for grabs, presuming the Republicans field a better candidate than they did last time with Roy Moore. So even though it may look on paper like the Democrats can win the Senate, it may be a tougher road. The flip side of that, however, is that it does not appear that if the Republicans keep the majority in the Senate, it is very unlikely that they will have 60 votes for a veto-proof majority. With respect to the 2020 presidential, the field of candidates for the Democratic nomination is growing by the day. There does not yet appear to be an heir apparent who can fend off the lesser-known potentials from entering the race. Vice President Biden entered last week ahead in the polls, but it doesn't seem to be a foregone conclusion that he will be the nominee. President Trump's ascension to the presidency with no experience or training has opened the door to countless candidates outside of the traditional mold. On the Democratic side, as of last week, there are 6 sitting U.S. senators, 1 former, 4 sitting U.S. House members, 3 formers, one of whom is now a governor, 1 former administration official, 2 mayors, and 2 governors, along with a handful of unknowns. These candidates are finding their paths and focusing on hot-button issues such as guns, climate, student loan forgiveness, to name a few, to excite the base. They are the most diverse group ever to seek a major party nomination. That variety is reflective of a party base increasingly made up of women, young people, and non-white voters. It includes several would-be firsts: the first woman president, the first Indian American president, the first Latino president, and first gay millennial president. Recent trends in presidential elections see states voting for the Senate candidate of the same party as their preferred presidential candidate, or straight ticket voting. So the presidential and Senate outcomes are inextricably linked, where the House tends to break away more easily. Finally, with respect to the House, there seems to be a more progressive voice emerging to drive the conversation. But Speaker Pelosi knows how the game is played, and she will continue to guide her caucus towards the middle ground where the potential for deal-making and compromise is greater.
We're going to now turn our attention to the budget and appropriations. You will recall that back in 2011, Congress passed and the President signed the Budget Control Act as sort of a part of the effort that year to raise the statutory debt limit. The Budget Control Act set in motion 10 years worth of statutory caps on appropriated funding, discretionary spending caps. Those caps expire in 2021. Twice before, there have been bipartisan agreements to adjust the caps upward to allow for more reasonable levels of discretionary spending. In 2017, a two-year agreement was reached for fiscal years 2018 and 2019. But this year, we're writing the bills for 2020, and the caps from 2011 remain in place. The House Budget Committee has reported the Investing for the People Act to make necessary adjustments in those spending caps to allow for more reasonable levels of appropriated funding. And you can see in the second chart those levels that are in that bill. The House was not able to pass this bill, which would amend in law those discretionary spending caps, but nevertheless they were able to deem or to say to the Appropriations Committee, you can mark up bills to those revised levels in the Investing for People Act and move forward with the appropriations process. And the House Appropriations Committee is doing so. And I will note there's an item of particular interest to this board that on Tuesday the House Appropriations Committee Subcommittee on Labor, Health and Human Services and Education reported their bill, and is the first appropriations bill to move forward in the House, that includes $50 million in funding on gun violence research. This will be the first time in over 20 years the federal government has conducted research on gun violence, and it's pretty significant. The bill, however, does leave in place the prohibition on using that research by the federal agencies for advocacy around gun research. Nevertheless, they can conduct the research, and other groups outside of government can use that research in their advocacy around gun violence, but the federal agencies, the Centers for Disease Control and the National Institutes of Health, are prohibited from doing any advocacy around that. So the appropriations process has begun in the House. Like I mentioned, the Labor HHS is the first bill out. Others will follow suit shortly. On the Senate side, the Senate Appropriations Chair, Richard Shelby from Alabama, has said he does not want to move forward with his committee until they have bipartisan agreement on these adjustments to the caps. And there's negotiations and discussions that are underway currently to revise the caps on a bipartisan basis. And I know Mr. Margolis is going to give a more detailed report on some of these issues, but just to give you a high level, the three big issues that we're seeing in the healthcare space are around the drug pricing, the so-called surprise medical bills, which involve patients unknowingly seeing providers outside their insurance network, and then the opioid crisis. And I should have began my remarks by saying, with the Democratic House, efforts to legislatively undermine the Affordable Care Act are off the table. In fact, the House is getting ready to pass a bill to strengthen or improve the Affordable Care Act. And in fact, the President recently encouraged Senator Murray, who is the ranking Democrat on the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, to pursue efforts to try and pick those improvements up in the Senate and to try and move forward with those efforts to try and improve the law. So different dynamics with that law. One other item to note, and I mentioned this to Mr. Williams yesterday, I know there's a lot of regulatory actions that are very troubling to this board, and you're taking a lot of legal and other actions around them, but there's actually something on the regulatory front that may be actually encouraging and of interest to the county and to your hospitals. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation has announced that they're moving forward with the demonstration project around reimbursement for ambulance providers. Under current law, Medicare can only reimburse an ambulance for transporting a patient to a hospital emergency department. That's the only way they can get reimbursement. And oftentimes, the ambulances arrive, the patients don't necessarily need to go to the emergency room. They could be treated on site or taken to other less costly care facilities. And so they're going to test this demo about having other treatments that could be done with these patients and reimbursing the ambulance providers for those treatments. And this summer, they'll put out an RFI that you may find of interest, and then this fall, they're going to put together the plans for this. But the intention is to contract with local governments and have local governments then in turn contract with ambulance providers to test out and evaluate this new payment model. So again, Mr. Margolis may elaborate on this further on his report. On infrastructure, is a big meeting yesterday at the White House with the President, Speaker Pelosi, and Leader Schumer. And at that meeting, they agreed to put together a $2 trillion stimulus package. That's a great news. And if, in fact, they are able to put together a $2 trillion stimulus package, or infrastructure package, I should say, we expect that that'll be a fairly broad piece of legislation, including the traditional roads and bridges and water projects and things of that nature. But a package that large will also probably include things around our energy system, energy transmission, schools, broadband. It may be fairly expansive with that amount of resources for it. I don't know if I'd call it bad news just yet, but the one missing piece of news is during the meeting yesterday, they did not have an agreement on how to pay for this $2 trillion infrastructure package, and they said they'd reconvene in, I think, 3 weeks to talk about funding options for that. In fact, the leaders from Congress said to the President, we'd love to hear how you intend to pay for this. So the burden's on the President to come up with some options that he could accept as ways to pay for this $2 trillion infrastructure package.
On to immigration. As you are all aware, immigration matters in Congress include a toxic mix of issues involving border security, asylum policy, family separation issues, and other issues such as the status of Dreamers, which have taken precedence over issues addressing legal immigration. Presidential advisor and son-in-law Jared Kushner is hoping to reprise his success in helping enact criminal justice reform by facilitating congressional reform of our legal immigration system and working on an administration version of a proposal. He will find this a much more difficult task, and progress is unlikely. While there is some congressional interest in reform of the high-tech visa program and other individual aspects of legal immigration, such as temporary seasonal worker visas, there seems presently to be insufficient support for compromise. The Democratic majority in the House will most likely pass a broad bill. Specifically, the Judiciary Committee is expected to take up H.R. 6, the American Dream and Promise Act of 2019. Highlights of the bill are that the bill provides a pathway to legal status for undocumented children brought to the U.S. and provides relief to holders of TPS, temporary protected status. However, a narrower bill for Dreamers is probably required for Senate passage so long as the White House indicates support. Next slide, please. Climate change. As we all know, there is little appetite for discussions of climate change in the Senate and in the administration. The Democratic House majority, however, along with some of the 2020 presidential candidates, have turned up the pressure as predicted. Speaker Pelosi reinstituted the House Select Committee on Climate Crisis, which is chaired by Representative Castor from Florida. And the committee, which does not have legislative authority, is charged with examining concerns about climate change in the wake of the UN's climate change report. It is somewhat noteworthy that there are 3 Democratic members from California on the committee, Representative Jared Huffman from the Bay Area and Representatives Brownlee and Levin from elsewhere in the state. To that end, the big ticket item for the House of Representatives this week is the Climate Crisis Committee's H.R. 9 Climate Action Now Act. The bill directs the President to develop a plan for the United States to meet its nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement. While it is really a messaging bill and has little prospect in the Senate, The hope behind the bill is to unify House Democrats on climate legislation, which is something the Green New Deal failed to accomplish. Next slide. Several other items that are noteworthy with respect to the county's interests. Regarding the census question on the 2020 census, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments last week. We will not hear the decision until the summer, but the expectation is that the decision will be 5-4 in favor of the question. Hope remains, however, that one of the justices will choose to protect the integrity of the court, of the institution of the court, and vote with the other side. With respect to net neutrality, the House passed a net neutrality bill within the past month. Senator McConnell, on the Senate side, unfortunately, has specifically addressed the issue and said that the Senate will not bring up the net neutrality bill this Congress, so it is not going anywhere this Congress. The Title IV-E waiver extension. Santa Clara County, along with other counties in California and several other states, rely on the funding flexibility for child welfare services that the Title IV-E waiver allows. The Families First legislation, which was part of the balanced budget agreement in 2018, alters the funding streams. Senators Feinstein and Rubio authored S-107, which provides for a several-year waiver extension so that counties that administer child welfare services have the time to plan and implement the new system. There are two possible House versions of the bill in the works, although neither has been introduced. The first bill is a companion bill, which mirrors the Senate bill, and the second goes a little further to address Families First implementation. We will keep you updated as those bills progress. And lastly, the Violence Against Women Act. The Violence Against Women Act reauthorization legislation passed the House of Representatives in early April. That legislation stands almost no chance of passing the Senate, as it contained more controversial items such as gun and other social provisions. Senator Feinstein, along with Senator Joni Ernst of Iowa, is writing a version that will be more agreeable to the Senate. We've not seen the text as it has not yet been released. It's important to note that even though the reauthorization has not been signed into law, the money has already been appropriated. And that's all we have. We're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Supervisor Cortese, you want to weigh in with comments or questions? You want me to? Either way. Please.
If that
go right
makes
ahead.
sense for me to get mine out of the way. Apologize for coming in late, but I caught most of this, and obviously the format was delivered in our packets, and I really appreciate this format. This alignment with county priorities in this way, it just makes a big difference hearing it from here, compared to some of our previous task force meetings. So I'm sure the chair had something to do with that, but it's a good idea. That said, my question is on the infrastructure meeting of yesterday, really just focusing in on the funding side. On the slide under where it says greatest hurdle, how to pay for it, the very first thing you have is VMT tax, and I'm intrigued by that, and I'm just wondering how much information there is around that in DC. I'm particularly intrigued by it because there was a regional effort here that the County Board of Supervisors hasn't officially weighed in on, but I was involved with as a member of the Metropolitan Transportation Commission called CASA, and the CASA organization, which CASA composition was about 48 folks, including private sector folks from around the county, came up with a number of ideas in terms of how to finance particularly housing infrastructure here in the Bay Area, and the jury's still out on that. I think State Assemblyman David Chu has got a bill that's still not teased out in terms of what exactly, what kind of revenue measures or resources would pay for it. But during that process, where I was on a steering committee that met quarterly to try to monitor what that group was doing, I suggested a VMT tax be looked at here in the region, just because it seemed to at least have the promise of being an incentive to, on the corporate side, if the tax was tied into corporate payers, employer payers at some level, to help us with so many of the regional goals here, the climate goals you see on the other slide, reducing GHG because of reduced trips, reducing congestion, encouraging housing closer to places of employment. I mean, just a whole, probably a dozen different priorities that we have here that would seem to be complemented by that. That said, right, I think about a month before that process wrapped up, they dropped VMT tax from the list of preferred, ideas or revenue measures. So it never really got, teased out here, in terms of how that would work. But so with that backdrop, two things I'm curious about would be this: would it be a VMT tax that is levied on the payroll side, like what I was just describing, or is it something that nobody knows how it would be levied, or is it something that would be sort of consumer levied, like congestion pricing somehow? The longer you drive, the more you're going to pay. I'm just wondering if there's any developed ideas on that, even in the Congress, and I guess that's it. And if not, that's fine, but I would ask, I'm going to give you a compound question, sort of, can you keep us posted, even off agenda, if this thing gets moving and they keep those kind of concepts, in the bill? It would be really, really important for us, I think, here in the Bay Area to know and to understand what kinds of criteria they would be placing on, that kind of a revenue measure.
Supervisor Cortese, I appreciate the question. This issue, funding of our infrastructure, is actually something I've worked on dating back to early 2000s, because back then even we were seeing with fuel-efficient cars and hybrid vehicles and the gas tax and carve-outs for incentives for ethanol and other things like this, we were seeing the gas tax revenues were on the decline. And we were trying to say way back then, hey, let's figure out a new way to fund our infrastructure, a more sustainable way. And back then, the VMT tax that was sort of put on the table back long ago was a more consumer facing, putting some kind of, at the time, putting some kind of device in the vehicles to track the miles. Today, with our technology, there are already apps that can and do track it, so it'd be fairly easier to implement something like this today, but it is sort of a consumer-facing levy is the intention. And again, and part of this too, as you mentioned about some of the goals for some of the negotiators, Speaker Pelosi and Leader Schumer in particular, part of their goals for this infrastructure package are with climate in mind. So what can we do to encourage other cleaner ways of transportation other than cars on the roads or planes in the air and things of that nature? So I think it's being put on the table as something of that nature. In the past, the trucking interests were very much against this kind of a tax because they obviously drive the most miles. Having said that, though, I think that there's probably some softening of their position because they realize how bad the infrastructure is and how much is needed to be refurbished. And so I think they're more willing to consider this. And again, you could do it maybe, it's on a sliding scale where it's not as punitive, if you will, to commercial interests versus other. There's ways they can figure out, but yes, it's more of a consumer-facing levy that they're thinking about now.
Yeah, through the chair, the last thing I would just say, for whatever weight my opinion carries, with Prime, is future lobbying activities. It seems to me that a good VMT tax would have to be shared by employer and employee for it to really work to create the incentives that we're talking about. I think the last number I heard was that we have about 160,000 in-commutes into the Bay Area every day, which is a problem in and of itself, of course. And I heard what you were saying. If a VMT tax, even on drivers or consumers, had a tendency to encourage people to look somewhere closer for a job or to take rail or alternative modalities, all good, all good. But the power of employment here is what's fueling the issue to a large degree in the first place, right? It's our success here in creating jobs, even on a per monthly basis, that outstrip what other metropolitan areas in the country can do over 6 or 7 years is phenomenal. But it's obviously employment's driven by employers. But if one of their criteria is not how can we hire people who are in closer proximity, I'm not sure they ever get that religion. Why would they? Does a big C corporation really make a decision about, do I care if the person's coming from Merced, or do I care if they're, riding a bike from 2 blocks away? Probably not, as long as they can do the job and return, ROI to my shareholders. So there's, my opinion again is that this kind of a tax would need to be embraced, not only by the people who are trying to get to their jobs, but by the folks who are providing those jobs to really shift, the paradigm to one that is everybody is looking for proximity all the time, in the employment and hiring practice, because everybody's incented to do so. So that was the nature of my question. I really appreciate you knew a lot more about it than I expected, especially given that this latest meeting just happened yesterday. I know the issue's been around. The idea's sort of been around for a long time, but thank you for that. Thank you, President.
Thank you, Supervisor Cortese. And if I could ask our friends at Prime to say thank you for the comment today, but if I could ask you to keep us posted if there are developments on that particular issue of the VMT that Supervisor asked for, Supervisor Cortese asked for. You can just give us something to and through our legislative team here at the county, and we would then ask them to share it as what we call an off-agenda report with all 5 members of the board. But clearly you've got interest on our part, Supervisor Cortese in particular, on this VMT issue, and so to the extent you can keep us posted. And Supervisor Cortese, I inferred from your comments that part of the interest is that this is, to some extent, interwoven with what we are talking about at the state level, and so understanding this is a matter of import not only from the federal side, but also from conversations we're having here at the state. Okay, thank you for that. I've got a couple of areas where I have some follow-up questions, and I just want to give Mr. Margolin a heads up that I'm going to come to him on one of them as well, even before we get to his formal report. On the gun violence issue, and this is going to be a recurring question on other issues. So we have some activity at the House level, or on the House side of the Hill. On that one, I wasn't clear. Is there reason to believe that on this there might be some ability to generate interest and support on the Senate side, where, of course, the partisan dynamics are very different?
The short answer is yes. The Senate Appropriations Committee has a long history of bipartisan support. So the Democratic senators on the Appropriations Committee, if this is a priority for them, there's a pretty good chance that some funding would make it into the bill. The chair of that subcommittee in the Senate, Senator Roy Blunt, he personally probably would want to see $0, but if his ranking member, Senator Murray, says this is a priority, we need to do what the House has done, I think he'd be willing to listen to her and put some monies in the bill. And ultimately, when the two sides negotiate, and if the House is at 50, and let's say the Senate's at a lesser amount, likely outcome, the two will work out and find a middle ground between them. So I think at the end of the day, I think there's a strong and good chance of federal funding coming out of these bills for next fiscal year.
And I understood you say first time in 20 years if that's a successful outcome. Yes.
Yes.
And the timeline on that happening, if it is to happen as part of the budget process?
So the timeline is, with the House reporting this as their first bill, the House is likely to pass this. The House will pass their version of labor aid sometime in July. How quickly the Senate can turn to their bills will depend on how quickly the negotiations over the budget caps take. But optimistically, if they can get agreement, on the budget caps in May, then Senate will start marking their bills up in June. And last year, Labor H was one of the bills that got actually signed into law, was not part of the continuing resolution. So there's a fairly good chance that this will be concluded by the end of September. It's possible it may drag on a bit longer than that, but I think it's, within the next few months, not a longer term view than that.
Got it. Thank you. And then you did make a passing reference on the ACA work, the Affordable Care Act work on the House side. And, if I remember correctly, one of the downsides of, among many in my view, but one of the downsides of the sort of constant efforts when there was a different majority in the House to gut the Affordable Care Act was that it precluded thoughtful discussion about, all right, there really are some fixes here that would make the Affordable Care Act work better for all of us, whether you like the fundamental premise or not. And I gathered from what you said that are those the kinds of issues that people are trying to tackle in this legislation?
Yes. So what the House is seeking to do is to, like you said, make the law work better. So some of the things that they've put in their legislation are funding for states to create their own exchanges. If you remember when the
Right.
law was first implemented, there was some struggles with creating these exchanges, and so a lot of states just said, okay, fine, we'll just use the federal one, and sort of gave up on their own efforts to create their own exchange. And the thinking is that if you have more state-based exchanges, we think that the system can overall work better, so that's one of the improvements. Another is creating a reinsurance corridor to help lower the prices in the individual and small group markets. And again, that, generally speaking, has had some bipartisan support and interest as a way to help relieve some of the pressure from some of the higher cost patients, if you will, that are in some of those pools in the smaller markets, and they're not, because they're smaller markets, not able to offset those costs as easily. So the reinsurance would help lower that price pressure.
And I thought I heard you say earlier in your presentation that there might be some support for this effort on the Senate side again. And I wanted to probe that a little because, the recent history has been that folks on the Republican side of the aisle have said, why would we want to fix what we think is a fundamentally unwise venture in the healthcare arena? So is there some reason for optimism this time around on the Senate side?
It's interesting. In the past, there have been some Republicans who have said, while we may not have agreed with this law going into place, it's in place and it's impacting people's lives, so let's make it as best a law as possible. So there is some interest on Republicans' part in doing that. In the last Congress, the Senate was working on a package of improvements to the law that was finding some stiff opposition from the House, then controlled by Republicans. So there's some optimism there can be some progress made depending on which elements of the House bill the Senate wants to take up. There is some controversy around the abortion issue, unfortunately, and that's what stalled those negotiations ultimately in the last Congress. So, with some more time and some more and with some more time, and now the president's encouraging the Senate to do this and not saying I will veto it, there's some reason for some optimism.
And excuse me, to do this is to, quote, fix the Affordable Care Act to some extent?
That's correct,
Okay.
yes.
And then shifting now, and this is where I'm going to ask you if you've got follow-up thoughts, but I'm also going to go to Mr. Margolis and possibly to our own staff. You mentioned the Centers for Medicare and Medi-Cal Innovation, and they're thinking about trying different approaches with respect to ambulance costs and reimbursement for Medicare, non-emergency visits. Does that present an I'm asking Mr. Marquez because, of course, we're in the process of renegotiating or negotiating or RFPing our own ambulance contracts here in the county, and it's one of the largest counties in the country. I'm wondering, does that present either an opportunity for us, a challenge for us, a set of issues we should be looking at, or Any thoughts on that, or shall I ask Mr. Margolin?
I'll answer briefly and then yield to Mr. Margolin.
Okay.
But, I think it's an opportunity for the county, and here's why. For many hospitals, one of the biggest cost centers is their emergency department. So if there's a way to reduce the volume through this demonstration project, I think there's some interest in doing that.
And excuse me, Mr. Mead, I want to highlight something you just said because it frankly had escaped my notice. Maybe everybody else picked up on it. But when you mentioned this the first time through, I thought, oh, okay, that would be a way to ensure that we were rationalizing the process and people were getting reimbursed for ambulance trips to other venues. I frankly had not focused on what you just highlighted, which is very important, which is, if we can reduce the number of trips to the emergency room, that is not only better health care, but has some significant financial consequences for us as well. So thank you for underscoring that. Go right ahead. I apologize.
Anyway, I think this is an interesting demonstration. I think it's worth your at least examining it. Like I said, the RFI is expected this summer. I think it's worth your taking a close look at that and see if it fits your priorities.
Okay.
It's on what we've heard about it, it sounds like a really good program, but again, some of the details are not there yet, so I'd encourage you to review those and see if they align with your priorities.
All right. Mr. Margolin, any thoughts on that specific to Santa Clara County's circumstance?
I agree with the idea here that Santa Clara County should evaluate whether the program would work for the county and potentially apply for a grant. There are 40 grants that are going to be offered nationally. It's a 2-year pilot, and for the reasons already articulated, it has the potential to be very good for any system that participates. Who wants to take someone to an emergency room when you can go to an urgent care center or to a doctor's office for a minor injury? If that option's available and you're reimbursed for it, that makes a great deal of sense. So the county should certainly look at the possibility of applying very, very seriously.
And Mr. Marquez, I don't know if this has been in your area of attention or Dr. Smith, but any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I've been working on this issue, and I would say certainly from, as has been already said, the impact on our operations could be positive. We should certainly look at that with the 3 hospitals that we operate. And with respect to the relationship we have with our current vendor, nothing I'm hearing is not, we could certainly work it into the process that we have as we try to improve our contractual relationship with that vendor. And depending on what ultimately comes out, I'm sure we could work into, if it's to benefit of the county and the vendor, we could certainly work that in a win-win situation for all
Thanks.
of us.
Could I ask you to give us an off-agenda report on this particular piece of the conversation, the topic, the potential for us to be a beneficiary of one of the grants that was described by Mr. Margolin in reference to the program that Mr. Mead shared with us? Just
sure,
keep us posted off agenda if you could, please. Thank you. And on infrastructure, can't resist. High-speed rail, any implications there? Since it's
I think, again, yes, it's on the table. When you're looking at surface
$2 trillion is a lot of money.
It certainly is in the mix. And again, that fits with sort of if one of the goals is to address climate issues, high-speed rail can be a good way to do that. So very likely they have some funds for that.
All right. And then I want to go to the census issue. Mr. Pike, I know this is an area that Congressman Khanna's office has been working on. And of course, as the folks from Prime certainly know, it's been a high priority for our county, and our county is taking steps to try and make sure we get a complete and accurate count. But thoughts you might want to share, Mr. Pike?
Yeah, thank you. And first, I did preliminarily just want to thank the county for having this task force. It's very mutually beneficial. I think, for example, the conversation about infrastructure today and VMT tax and so on, because Congressman Khanna is actually providing written testimony today about the need for a robust and sustained investment in our national transportation infrastructure. So it's very timely. I will report to our DC office about what I've heard today, and I'll also try to get some information back to you. Like like I said, they're working on it as we speak. So very timely, and thank you for that. With regards to the census, I did want to point out that our office has met. I have met with the county's Office of Census, Nick Kawada and his team. I'm going to be meeting with the Census Office's Immigrants Subcommittee tomorrow, and we'll all be working with the Santa Clara County Complete Counts Committee, the Alameda County Complete Counts Committee, and coordinating on programs and events that can get the word out and also address the concerns that have been raised and will continue to be raised. For example, the citizenship question, which is, as reported earlier, was just heard in oral arguments this week before the U.S. Supreme Court, and we'll be waiting for that result, presumably in June. I'm not exactly sure, but that's what I've heard we might hear. In any case, I just wanted to thank the county for the engagement on this. We will be working with the Office of the Census. It's an all-hands-on-deck project, and we'll be doing a lot of things. I think we're focusing like on August, really, to have some events with the congressmen, with the counties, and a lot of the stakeholders, including community-based organizations. So it's a big project, and I just want to thank the county again for leading on this.
Thank you. Before we leave this census item, I just want to confirm, Ms. Dorton, June sound like the right date for getting some clarity from the Supreme Court on the
As I understand it's been indicated that it's going to be June. I don't know that that's set in stone. I also wanted to note that I believe today or this week there's a hearing going on about how to proceed and whether they're going to do some type of an investigation, and I don't know the details because I just noted it earlier this morning, that there's going to be some type of, I don't know if it's a survey with respect to how accurate the census would be if the census question were included, and it may be too little too late is what some of the members had been saying. So we will keep you updated on that because I don't have enough information yet, but I just wanted to share that.
Thanks. An issue that I've raised previously but would like to follow up on, and I'll prevail upon both Congressman Khanna's office and Mr. Pike if possible, but also on your offices. And this is one of those issues that it's tough to raise for reasons that will become readily apparent. So we're moving to an online census in a significant measure this time around. That has raised concerns, at least on my part, and I've heard from other commentators, about the data security. And, in a news environment where, 2.5 years later, we're still talking about hacking from the last election and the concern about hacking in the next election. The Office of Personnel Management was the sort of the federal compromise of 20+ million records that you would think would be pretty securely kept given the importance of those records to the federal government. It generates some concern on my part about the integrity of the confidentiality commitment that's made with respect to the census. So I would appreciate hearing back from anyone who has information, and again, we can just do this with what we call an off-agenda report, about what, if anything, should make us feel confident or comfortable that the information is going to be safe and secure and beyond compromise. I think the history of all this is that there's no such thing as impregnable when it comes to data security. All you can do is try and stay a step ahead, and that's a cause for concern. Now, having said all that, Supervisor Cortese and I with our colleagues are in the business of trying to make sure we get a complete count, and so we're out there encouraging people to participate. So I don't want to be waving red flags if there is no need for red flags, because I do worry that if people are concerned about providing information online because they're not absolutely confident that it's going to be secure, then that could lead us to an undercount, which is the thing we're all working so hard to avoid. So I got a bit of a catch-22 here, which is I feel like this issue about data security is an important one and needs to be teased out. We need to get some good answers. On the other hand, I don't want to kick up a ruckus if that's not really the appropriate concern, because I don't want to give folks any reason to avoid participating in the census. So I'm sort of stuck on this one, and anything could provide in the way of just clarity about what the nature of the precautions, protections is, and how reasonably sure we can be that it's beyond compromise would be appreciated. Okay? All right. Thank you very much. That takes us to our next item, item number 8, and this is to receive a verbal report from the Office of the County Executive relating to the federal health policy and budget landscape, including proposed legislation relating to prescription drug pricing, among others. And Mr. Marquez, I'm going to turn to you, but I know you're going to turn to others, and I know others are going to turn to others. So let's see how that goes, okay?
Yes, I will turn it over to Danielle Christian, who I think will introduce Burt Margolin.
Yes, Burt Margolin from the Margolin Group is on the line, and he will be providing this report.
Great. Mr. Margolin, what's the latest?
Yes. Well, a number of things to talk about. First of all, I want to start off by saying that I agree with Prime Policy that the Affordable Care Act is safe for the moment for all sorts of reasons that have already been articulated. Mr. Mead did reference these bills to strengthen the Affordable Care Act, restore marketing dollars, establish a reinsurance program. A series of bills did pass the House Energy and Commerce Committee, and I agree with him that there is a possibility that the Senate could take up one or more of them as part of a larger package. It's important to remember, as far as history is concerned, that when Senator Collins voted for the repeal of the individual mandate tax a few years ago, she was promised by the Senate leadership, Republican leadership, that they would work with her to strengthen the ACA through things like a reinsurance program and other fixes. It was the House Republicans who blocked that effort, as Mr. Mead alluded to. And now that Democrats control the House and they're moving bills, there is a scenario here where some ACA strengthening gets done, although the politics of it is still fairly intense. And notwithstanding what the president may have said to Senator Murray about his own encouragement of this effort, it's going to be hard to get this done. But it is out there. There's also the Texas litigation. It's already been referenced, moving through the appeals process. Still a threat, but more and more Senate Republicans are distancing themselves from that effort. In fact, interesting illustration of the Senate Republican posture occurred last week when Senator Grassley of Iowa, at a town hall meeting in Iowa, was confronted by a constituent who said that she had a pre-existing medical condition, was very worried about legal and political challenges to the Affordable Care Act, congressional challenges, and wanted to know what Senator Grassley would do about this. And he basically told her that in his view, all efforts to repeal the law, including the litigation, are going to fail, and concluded by saying that she really doesn't have anything to worry about. She tried to press him on why he voted for these repeal measures, and he kind of sidestepped that issue by simply once again repeating that she's not in any jeopardy. So it shows how much on the defensive Senate Republicans have become following the 2016 election when it comes to the ACA. Next topic I want to touch on briefly is the Medicare for All single-payer issue. It's still the focus of many Democrats, especially in the House. Speaker Pelosi and the House leadership have been trying to keep their members focused on strengthening the ACA as the main goal for House Democrats. But a hearing was held yesterday on the Medicare for All issue in the Rules Committee. And so again, the leadership is giving the Medicare for All side a full airing in Rules. Did that yesterday, and the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee also promised the Progressive Caucus yesterday that they will eventually have a hearing in the Ways and Means Committee on Medicare for All. So there's an airing of the issue. We're very far away from any votes being cast. The area, of course, where there is the greatest potential for actual agreement and actual lawmaking this year is prescription drug costs. There's bipartisan agreement already that something needs to be done. various approaches, various ideas floating, some where there are sharp divisions, others where there is a consensus developing. The House Energy and Commerce Committee on April 4th passed a series of bills designed to accelerate the movement to market of generic drugs. That's really where much of the bipartisan consensus is right now. Generic drugs are typically 80 to 85% cheaper than brand name drugs, so more generic drugs on the market could have a massive impact on the price consumers pay, and in many cases the price that healthcare delivery systems have to absorb for their drugs. The bills on generic drugs all passed with a unanimous vote, bipartisan unanimous vote. A prime example of a reform effort in this generic drug realm that both the House on a bipartisan basis supports, and there's also bipartisan support in the Senate, involves the issue of brand name drug manufacturers entering into agreements with generic manufacturers to pay them money. The generic manufacturers receive money from the brand name manufacturers to delay the entry of the generic drug into the marketplace. It's called pay for delay, and there's President Trump in his budget has a measure that would tackle or attempt to tackle pay for delay. Senator Grassley is against pay for delay, and the House has passed a bill that would outlaw pay for delay. So there's a lot of agreement on that. Another example of a generic drug initiative that's received a lot of interest is the question of how brand name drug companies deal with generic drug companies when they want samples of the drug to do their research with. They need thousands and thousands of samples to really effectively develop their generic alternative, and brand name drug manufacturers have often avoided giving those samples out, found ways to delay or defer the delivery of the samples. There's a bill that just passed the House Judiciary Committee yesterday as part of a bipartisan package, which would penalize drug makers that withhold samples from their generic rivals. So a lot of activity on the generic front. A major reason why there is optimism, as I mentioned a moment ago, for an ultimate law being enacted is not just all this activity on the House side, but we do have Senator Grassley, the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, very committed to tackling drug pricing, and also in agreement on some of the same solutions that are being advanced in the House. He's actually the co-author of a bill with Senator Klobuchar to end this pay-for-delay approach. He's also working with Senator Wyden on trying to figure out a solution to the high cost of insulin drugs, and he's been very proactive. He's also been supportive of another concept, which is allowing pharmaceuticals to be purchased under certain circumstances from Canada. Again, there's bipartisan interest in that. Still some significant differences over under what circumstances the drugs can be purchased and who can do the purchasing, but that issue's out there as well. So that's generic drugs, and that's purchasing from Canada. The other area where we're not yet in bipartisan agreement, in fact, there are very sharp differences. The other area that's being pursued involving drug pricing is the question of how do you use the market power of the federal government in Medicare to leverage lower drug prices. Democrats like Senator Sanders and many House Democrats are supporting giving CMS the authority to negotiate all Medicare Part D drug prices directly with the pharmaceutical manufacturers. In other words, use the full market power of Medicare to drive down the price of Medicare Part D drugs. There was a period of time, a month or so back, where the House leadership staff decided to work on a more limited approach to this issue. They wanted to not do full negotiations, but in fact to do what they call binding arbitration on a limited class of drugs only. And the House leadership staff thought this had the potential for bipartisan agreement. Progressive Democrats and the Progressive Caucus have pushed back on that and have said they don't want to settle for just binding arbitration on a limited class of drugs. They want all Medicare Part D drugs to be subject to full negotiation by CMS. And there was a meeting yesterday with the Progressive Caucus and Chairman Pallone of the House Energy and Commerce Committee and Speaker Pelosi. And after the meeting, Pelosi and Pallone said they have not committed to the arbitration approach, which is the more limited approach. They are open to the broader strategy. Congressman Doggett of Texas, chair of the Ways and Means Subcommittee, has a bill that would require Health and Human Services to negotiate Part D prices in a very aggressive manner with very severe sanctions actually in the bill if things aren't, if there are not good faith negotiations. And progressives are rallying around that bill, and right now the leadership is saying we're open to all possibilities here. There also is an area of discussion about capping the annual out-of-pocket costs under Medicare Part D for consumers. There's no consensus yet on how to do this. It's very complicated. It's a complicated formula as to how people have their drugs priced under Medicare Part D, but Senator Wyden, the ranking member of Senator Finance, is looking for what he calls a hard cap on out-of-pocket costs, and again, there'll be a lot of debate and discussion about that. So what does all this mean for Santa Clara County? Let me talk about that just briefly. So we'll start with the residents of the county before I get to our Valley Medical Center system. As far as residents are concerned, efforts to promote the use of generic drugs and to limit cost sharing under Medicare Part D, will be very beneficial if they're achieved for individuals with chronic conditions that require ongoing medication. Thousands of dollars per year in savings are potentially available to them. So for individual consumers, individual Medicare beneficiaries within the county, there is a lot at stake in this debate, a lot of benefit if it goes well. As for the Santa Clara Valley Medical Center, there's also a benefit, but it's a smaller benefit, and that's for a couple of reasons. The first is that the focus of this debate is Medicare, not Medicaid, and Valley Medical Center, which purchases about $120 million a year in medications, most of that money is spent on Medi-Cal reimbursed medications, not Medicare. There's money at risk here and potential benefit, but it's a relatively small percentage of the overall prescription drug spending. And on the issue of generics, the push to generics, that's obviously would be helpful, but Valley Medical Center already is mainly in the generic business in terms of the drugs that are used. 70% of the drug volume is generic. Only about 11% is branded. So again, if more generics are available, that 11% of branded drugs could go down to 10, 9, 8, 7. There's a value in that, but it's not going to be a dramatic difference. The biggest threat on prescription drug pricing in terms of Valley Medical Center, as we discussed in the past, has been this 340B discount issue. There was a threat in the Congress last year to potentially eliminate and or fundamentally change 340B savings under Medicaid. That is not part of the federal debate this year. The House leadership has made it clear they're not looking at 340B as of now. We still need to monitor it because that can change. 340B can reemerge at some point in the process, but that's our biggest risk, and that's currently not part of the discussion. Where it is part of the discussion, as we all know, is at the state level, where the governor's executive order on pharmaceuticals has the potential to impact 340B, and where the county is closely following that discussion and needs to be mindful of what's at risk there. So that's pharmaceutical drugs. And then before taking your comments and questions, the last issue I want to report on is the Title X rule, which was recently finalized and was designed to push Planned Parenthood and other healthcare organizations that counsel on abortion or provide abortion out of the Title X family planning program. It's an issue I know the county's been concerned about and engaged on. There have been 3 federal judges who've ruled on this issue within the last week and have issued preliminary injunctions to stop the implementation of the rule. One of the judges has made the restraining order apply to the entire nation. Another judge here in California is having it apply only in California. But again, there's a significant judicial pushback, at least in the first round, on the Title X rule, and it's important for us all to be aware of where that fight is. So I'm happy to take questions and respond to any comments you might have.
Thank you. Very thorough, very comprehensive. I do have one quick question, and I just wanted to make sure I understood you right, because it was a significant number, and that is, did I understand you to say that generics typically cost 80 to 85% less than brand name drugs?
Yes, that is what the FDA says when they put out information on the value of generics versus brand name. The FDA statistic on that is that generics on average are 80 to 85% less than their brand name counterpart.
And I know you just said this, but I just want to confirm it and that I'm understanding. That's very different, of course, than saying that they are 85% of the price of brand name drugs. And you're not saying 85% of the price of brand name drugs. You're saying 85% less, yes?
I'm saying less. And again, what the actual price is, again, there are so many factors in drug pricing. But I think that FDA statistic does relate to what to prices that are offered.
Got it. No, I think, it's a noteworthy, when people talk about this conversation of generics, sort of understanding just how significant that conversation is an important part. That was really the only question I had. You did cover a lot of ground, and we'll follow up with you in health and hospitals as well. So I want to turn to Supervisor Cortese, see if he had any comments or questions about any of that.
No, I'm good. Thank you.
All right. Prime, did that prompt anything on your end that you wanted to add on to?
No, I think those are very robust reports. So
Okay.
Nothing to add.
All right. Then before we make our way to the end of the meeting, I'm going to say, for the record, on item number 1, the call to order, will duly note that both Supervisors Cortese and Simonian are present, and therefore a quorum was established. Supervisor Cortese, if I can get a motion from you to approve the consent calendar.
So moved.
And without objection, this is item number 3, so ordered. And that would then take us to item number 10, which is to adjourn. And so without objection, we will say thank you to all, unless there's any last comment. I do want to see if there's anything else. Then without objection, we're adjourned. Thank you all very much.